harsh winter wind swept across the plains of eastern Montana, rattling the windows of St. Mary's Community Church. Inside, Reverend Thomas Miller stood beside a wooden crib, his weathered face creased with concern as he gazed at the sleeping infant wrapped in a thin blanket. The baby girl had been found that morning on the church steps, with nothing but a tattered note that read, "Her mother died. Her father is gone. Please care for her." "What are we going to do, Thomas?" asked Martha Wilson, the church secretary who had discovered the child. Her voice trembled slightly, fogging in the cold air of the church's back room. "We'll call social services in the morning," the Reverend replied, adjusting the radiator. "It's too dangerous for anyone to drive to Helena tonight with the storm coming in." News of the abandoned baby spread quickly through the small town of Clearwater. By evening, a small crowd had gathered in the church, bringing whatever baby supplies they could find, formula, diapers, a few second-hand onesies. But as they huddled around the makeshift nursery, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. "Poor little thing," whispered Eleanor Jenkins, the town's librarian. "Does she have a name?" The Reverend shook his head. The note didn't mention one. "Well, we should give her one," suggested Dave Larson, who owned the local hardware store, "just until the proper authorities take over." But no one spoke up. In a town still reeling from tragedy, naming the child felt like an act of attachment no one was ready for. 3 months earlier, Clearwater had been devastated when the Wilkins family, Josh, Sarah, and their newborn daughter, had perished in a house fire. The community was still grieving, and the arrival of another orphaned baby reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. "Maybe we shouldn't," said Mayor Frank Cooper, his voice low. "Social services will handle all that. Getting attached would just make things harder, for her and for us." The others nodded in somber agreement. In a town of just over 500 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the unnamed child became an uncomfortable reminder of their collective vulnerability. As the meeting dispersed, Reverend Miller made calls to arrange temporary care. The county social worker couldn't make it through the storm until roads cleared, which could take days. Volunteers were organized in shifts to look after the baby, though most avoided looking at her directly, as if making eye contact might somehow form a bond they weren't prepared to risk. On the outskirts of town, Jack Callahan sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. At 45, the third-generation cattle rancher lived alone on the 500-acre property he'd inherited from his father. The radio crackled with news of the storm and, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the abandoned baby found at St. Mary's. Jack's calloused hand tightened around his mug. 15 years ago, his wife Caroline and their unborn child had died in childbirth. He'd retreated into the isolation of his ranch ever since, appearing in town only when necessary for supplies or business matters. The next morning, Jack drove his truck through 8 inches of fresh snow to check on his cattle. As he passed the church, he noticed Martha Wilson struggling to carry groceries inside. He pulled over, offering to help. "Thank you, Jack," she said, surprised to see the reclusive rancher. "We're a bit overwhelmed with our unexpected guest." Inside, the baby lay awake in her crib, tiny fists waving in the air. Jack stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the child. Something in his chest constricted painfully. "No one will even say her name," Martha commented, arranging formula on a nearby table. "She doesn't have one," Jack replied, still watching the infant. "That's what I mean. No one wants to give her one. It's like they're afraid to acknowledge she exists." The baby's eyes found Jack's, and he felt a jolt of recognition, not of her, but of something within himself that had been dormant for too long. "Hope," he said suddenly. "What?" Martha turned to him. "Her name is Hope," Jack repeated, more firmly this time. "At least until someone tells us different." Martha's expression softened. "Hope," she echoed. "It suits her." As Jack finally approached the crib, the baby, Hope, reached up and wrapped her tiny fingers around his rough index finger. And for the first time in 15 years, Jack Callahan felt something inside him begin to thaw. By the 3rd day of the snowstorm, Clearwater remained effectively cut off from the rest of the county. The social worker called to say she couldn't make it through until the plows cleared the highway, which might take another week. The Reverend assured her that the baby was being well cared for, though he carefully avoided using the name Jack had given her. Jack Callahan found himself returning to the church each day, ostensibly to deliver fresh milk and eggs from his farm. But everyone knew his real reason was the child. While the rest of the town maintained a careful emotional distance, Jack sat beside the crib for hours, talking softly to Hope about cattle breeding, weather patterns, and the proper way to mend fences. "You're good with her," Martha Wilson observed one afternoon, finding Jack gently rocking the fussing infant. "She settles right down for you." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Animals or babies, they can sense when you're afraid. I'm just not afraid of her." "And the rest of us are?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. "This town's carrying around too much grief," Jack replied. "Sometimes it's easier to look away than to risk caring about something that might be taken away." Word spread about Jack's attachment to the baby, and the whispers began. Some found it touching, the reclusive rancher finding connection with an abandoned child. Others found it concerning. "He's getting too attached," Mayor Cooper commented during the town council's emergency meeting about the situation. "What happens when social services finally gets here? Has anyone thought about that?" Eleanor Jenkins, who had been watching the exchange with increasing irritation, finally spoke up. "For heaven's sake, Frank, the man's showing basic human kindness to an infant who needs it. What exactly are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid we're setting ourselves up for more heartbreak," the mayor replied defensively. "After what happened to the Wilkins family." "This isn't about the Wilkins," Eleanor interrupted. "It's about this child right here, right now." The debate continued, splitting the town into factions. Some began using the name Hope, following Jack's lead. Others pointedly referred to her only as the baby or the child, as if giving her a name would somehow be tempting fate. Dr. Helen Rivera, Clearwater's only physician, examined Hope daily and found her thriving despite her uncertain circumstances. "She's gaining weight appropriately," she informed the Reverend. "No signs of illness or developmental concerns." "That's good news," Reverend Miller replied. "Jack will be relieved to hear it." Dr. Rivera hesitated before speaking again. "Thomas, I'm concerned about what happens next. The longer she stays, the harder it will be, especially for Jack." "I know," the Reverend sighed. "But what can we do? Until the road's clear." On the fifth night, the church's ancient heating system finally gave out. With temperatures dropping well below freezing, Reverend Miller faced a difficult decision. "We need to move her somewhere warmer," he told the small group of volunteers. "At least until we can get the furnace repaired." Several people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Taking the baby into their homes felt like crossing an invisible line they weren't prepared to cross. "I'll take her," Jack said from the doorway, where he'd arrived with his evening delivery of supplies. "My ranch house is well heated, and I've got plenty of room." A heavy silence followed his offer. "Jack," the Reverend began carefully, "are you sure that's wise? The social worker could arrive any day now. And when she does, I'll bring Hope back," Jack replied firmly. "But until then, she needs warmth, and I've got it." That evening, Jack drove home with the baby secured in a makeshift car seat, a padded laundry basket firmly strapped in place. As he carried her into his house, he realized it was the first time in 15 years that he wasn't coming home to an empty building. He placed her crib in the living room near the fireplace and spent the night in the armchair beside her, waking at each small sound she made. By morning, he had rearranged half his house, moving furniture to create a safer space, washing dusty curtains to reduce allergens, and digging out old photographs from storage boxes. In one frame, Caroline smiled back at him from their wedding day. Jack placed a photo on the mantel, angled so it seemed to be watching over Hope's crib. "I think you would have liked her," he whispered to the photograph. "I think you would have told me to help her." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Clearwater continued to whisper. On the 8th day, the plows finally cleared the highway to Helena. Meredith Daniels, the county social worker, arrived in Clearwater by mid-morning, her government-issued sedan carefully navigating the still icy roads. Her first stop was St. Mary's Church, where she was surprised to learn that the abandoned baby wasn't there. She's staying with Jack Callahan, Reverend Miller explained, offering Meredith a cup of coffee. Our heating system failed, and he volunteered his home. Jack Callahan. Meredith frowned, consulting her notes. I don't see him listed as an approved emergency foster provider. It was an emergency situation, the Reverend said defensively. Jack has been the child's primary caretaker since she arrived. The whole town has helped, of course, but Jack, well, he's formed a special bond with her. Meredith's expression remained professionally neutral. I'll need to see the child immediately and assess the situation. Can you direct me to Mr. Callahan's property? The drive to Jack's ranch took 20 minutes along winding country roads. Meredith noted the well-maintained fences and healthy cattle dotting the snow-covered pastures. The ranch house itself was older but sturdy, a two-story structure with smoke curling from the chimney. Jack opened the door before she could knock, his expression guarded. You must be from social services, he said. Reverend Miller called to say you were coming. Mr. Callahan. Meredith introduced herself, extending her hand. I'm here about the abandoned infant. Her name is Hope, Jack corrected, stepping aside to let her in. And she's in the living room. The interior of the ranch house surprised Meredith. Though undeniably masculine in its furnishings, it was clean and unexpectedly child-friendly. Blankets were folded neatly on the sofa, and she noticed a stack of parenting books on the coffee table. Hope lay in her crib, batting at a mobile Jack had fashioned from colorful ribbons and small wooden carvings of farm animals. When she saw Jack, her face lit up with a toothless smile. I see she recognizes you, Meredith observed, setting down her briefcase. We've spent a lot of time together this past week, Jack replied, lifting Hope from the crib with practiced ease. The baby immediately nestled against his shoulder, her tiny hand clutching his flannel shirt. Meredith spent the next hour conducting her assessment, examining Hope, reviewing the makeshift records Dr. Rivera had kept of her health, and interviewing Jack about the care routines they'd established. Throughout it all, Jack answered her questions directly, but kept one hand gently resting on Hope's back. Mr. Callahan, Meredith finally said, closing her notebook. I appreciate everything you've done for this child, but I need to be clear about what happens next. My job is to place her in an approved foster home while we attempt to locate any relatives. If none are found, she'll become eligible for adoption. Jack's jaw tightened. When will you take her? I have a placement lined up in Helena, Meredith replied. I can transport her there this afternoon. This afternoon? Jack echoed, his voice hollow. Just like that. I understand this is difficult, Meredith said, her tone softening slightly. But this was always a temporary situation. Jack looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in his arms. Would it be possible for me to apply to foster her? Officially. Meredith hesitated. Becoming a foster parent is a lengthy process, Mr. Callahan. There are home studies, background checks, training requirements. I understand, Jack said firmly. And I'm willing to do all of it. But in the meantime, does she really need to leave today? Can't she stay here while I start the process? Before Meredith could respond, a knock came at the door. Jack opened it to find Mayor Cooper, Eleanor Jenkins, and several other townspeople standing on his porch. We heard the social worker was here, Eleanor explained. We wanted to come and, well, to say goodbye to Hope. Jack stepped back, allowing them inside. To his surprise, more vehicles were pulling up his driveway. Dr. Rivera, Reverend Miller, even Dave Larson from the hardware store. Soon, his living room was filled with people who had spent the past week avoiding attachment to the very child they now came to see. Mr. Callahan was just asking about becoming Hope's foster parent. Meredith explained to the group. He'd be excellent, Dr. Rivera said immediately. I've observed his care firsthand. The child is thriving with him. One by one, the townspeople voiced their support. Even Mayor Cooper acknowledged that Jack had proven himself capable. The thing is, Reverend Miller added, this isn't just about Jack anymore. Hope has become important to all of us. The name we were afraid to say has become the one thing bringing our community together again. Meredith looked around the room, at the unlikely gathering of people united by concern for one small child. I can make some calls, she said finally. No promises, but perhaps we can arrange a temporary emergency certification while the formal process begins. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jack Callahan smiled. 3 months passed like a changing season. Winter gave way to spring, and the Montana landscape transformed from white to vibrant green. On Jack Callahan's ranch, the changes were even more profound. The spare bedroom that had once been filled with dusty boxes now featured pale yellow walls, a proper crib, and a rocking chair positioned perfectly beneath the window. The kitchen counter held bottles and formula alongside Jack's coffee maker. A playpen occupied the corner of the living room, surrounded by soft toys, donated by townspeople who now regularly visited the ranch they had previously avoided for years. Jack himself had changed, too. The perpetual shadow of grief that had darkened his features for 15 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had lightened, making room for something new purpose. On a bright Tuesday morning, Jack sat at his kitchen table across from Meredith Daniels, who was conducting her monthly home visit. Hope babbled happily in her high chair, messily consuming pureed carrots. "Your formal foster parent certification came through," Meredith announced, sliding a document across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Callahan. You're officially Hope's foster father." Jack stared at the paper, his weathered fingers tracing over Hope's name and his own, linked together in black ink. "Any word on finding her family?" Meredith shook her head. "We've exhausted all leads. No one has come forward, and we've found no matching missing persons reports for a mother and infant. The case will soon transition to termination of parental rights, after which—" She paused, watching Jack carefully. "After which, she'll be eligible for adoption." Jack nodded, absorbing this information while wiping carrot from Hope's chin. "And if I wanted to adopt her?" "You'd be given priority consideration as her foster parent," Meredith replied. "Though I should tell you, there's been interest from other families. A healthy infant is—" "I know," Jack interrupted. "She's what everyone wants." He looked at Hope, who grinned back at him, revealing her first 2 teeth. "But I think she belongs here, in Clearwater." Later that afternoon, Jack drove into town with Hope securely fastened in her car seat. His first stop was Clearwater's only law office, where he spent an hour with Henry Walsh, discussing the legal process of adoption. "It won't be simple," Henry warned. "Single men adopting infant girls face additional scrutiny. They'll look at your age, your work schedule, your support system." "I'm 45, not 80, Jack replied dryly. "I run a successful ranch that allows me to be home. And as for support—" He glanced out the window at Main Street, where Eleanor Jenkins was emerging from the library, carrying a stack of children's books she'd been setting aside for Hope. "I've got the whole town now." As if to prove his point, Jack's next stop was the community center, where he'd been surprised to discover a newly formed parents group. What had begun as a few people helping with Hope had evolved into a regular gathering of Clearwater's parents, who shared resources, advice, and childcare. Jack, despite his initial reluctance, had become a regular attendee. "There he is," called Martha Wilson as Jack entered with Hope. "And just in time. We're discussing the summer festival, and we need your input on the children's activities." Jack found himself surrounded by people who, months ago, had barely acknowledged him around town. Now they included him naturally in their conversations and plans, asking his opinion and offering their help. Hope was passed around the circle, receiving kisses and tickles from everyone she encountered. On the drive home, Jack pulled over at the hilltop overlooking both his ranch and the town below. He lifted Hope from her car seat and stood at the edge of the overlook, holding her so she could see the panoramic view. "That's our home," he told her, pointing to the ranch house in the distance. "And that's our town." He gestured toward Clearwater, where the afternoon sun glinted off the church steeple and the rooftops of buildings along Main Street. Hope reached out a small hand, as if trying to grasp the entire scene. "They were afraid to name you," Jack continued softly. "They thought that giving you a name meant risking their hearts again. But you know what? Sometimes the biggest risk is not opening your heart at all." He turned Hope to face him, her bright eyes studying his face with the unguarded curiosity of infancy. In those eyes, Jack saw not just his future, but the future of Clearwater itself, a community learning to hope again after loss. "Tomorrow," he whispered, kissing her forehead, "we're going to start the paperwork to make your name permanent. Hope Callahan. What do you think of that?" Hope responded by grabbing his nose and giggling, which Jack took as enthusiastic approval. As they drove down the hill toward home, Jack realized that for the first time in 15 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The Clearwater Summer Festival had been a town tradition for generations, though in recent years it had diminished to little more than a brief ceremony and a potluck lunch. This year, however, the festival grounds bustled with activity: food vendors, game booths, a small Ferris wheel, and a central stage decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. "I can't remember the last time we had this kind of turnout," Reverend Miller commented to Mayor Cooper as they surveyed the crowd. "Must be half the county here." "It's because of Hope," the mayor replied, watching as Jack Callahan made his way through the festival with the now 10-month-old girl perched on his shoulders. Or rather, what she represents. The adoption hearing was scheduled for the following week, and the festival had unofficially become a celebration of Hope's permanent place in the community. Jack was stopped every few feet by well-wishers offering congratulations and small gifts: hand-knitted sweaters, wooden toys, books for a growing library. Near the bandstand, Eleanor Jenkins had organized a community photo exhibition titled Clearwater Remembers. Enlarged photographs from the town's history lined the walls of a tent, chronicling moments of both hardship and joy. The Wilkins family featured prominently in one section: Josh coaching the high school baseball team, Sarah organizing the Christmas pageant, their baby daughter asleep in her mother's arms at her christening. Jack paused before these photos, lifting Hope down from his shoulders to hold her in his arms. "Those are the Wilkins," he explained quietly. "They were good people who loved their little girl very much, just like I love you." Dr. Rivera, who had been hanging nearby, approached them. "You know, I delivered their daughter," she said, "and I was there the night we lost them. For months afterward, I questioned whether I could continue practicing medicine here. Every baby I saw reminded me of the one I couldn't save." She gently touched Hope's cheek. "But then you arrived, and Jack called you Hope. At first, I resisted that name. It felt too much like tempting fate. But then I realized that's exactly what hope is: defying fear, choosing to believe in possibility despite knowing the risks." Throughout the day, similar conversations unfolded across the festival grounds. The abandoned baby, who had once been too painful to name, had become the catalyst for a community's healing. People who had been avoiding each other out of shared grief now found themselves sharing memories, laughing about old times, and making plans for future gatherings. As evening approached, everyone gathered on the hillside for the festival's culminating event, a lantern release traditionally held in remembrance of loved ones lost. Jack stood with Hope in his arms, surrounded by their neighbors and friends. "Before we begin," Reverend Miller announced, "Jack Callahan has asked to say a few words." Jack stepped forward, adjusting Hope on his hip. He had never been one for public speaking, but looking out at the faces turned toward him, faces that had transformed from strangers to family over the past 10 months, he found the words he needed. "A year ago, I was a man who lived alone and liked it that way," he began. "I thought I'd buried my capacity for connection alongside my wife and unborn child. Then Hope arrived, and this stubborn town refused to name her." A ripple of acknowledging laughter moved through the crowd. "But names have power," Jack continued. "They make things real. When I called her Hope, I wasn't just naming a baby. I was naming what she gave back to me, and eventually to all of us." He looked down at Hope, who was contentedly playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Tomorrow marks 1 year since she was left at St. Mary's. Next week, if all goes well, she'll legally become Hope Callahan. But the truth is, she already belongs to all of us. She's Clearwater's daughter as much as she is mine." Martha Wilson stepped forward, holding a lantern. "We traditionally release these to remember those we've lost," she said. "But this year, I'd like to suggest we also release them to celebrate what we've found: our sense of community, our willingness to risk loving again, our hope." One by one, the lanterns were lit and released into the darkening sky, creating a constellation of moving lights above the town. Jack helped Hope reach up her small hand to release their lantern, her delighted laughter carrying across the suddenly quiet hillside. As the last lantern drifted upward, Mayor Cooper cleared his throat. "I have an announcement," he said. "The town council met yesterday and unanimously voted to rename the community playground. Next month, we'll be dedicating the Hope Callahan Memorial Park in honor of new beginnings and in remembrance of those who came before." Jack felt tears prick his eyes as neighbors surrounded him and Hope, their hands on his shoulders, their voices offering congratulations and thanks. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and connection, Jack understood that the name no one had dared to speak had become the word that defined them all. The town that had refused to name the child had found its own rebirth in finally speaking that name aloud. And as Hope fell asleep against his chest under the canopy of floating lights, Jack Callahan knew with absolute certainty that the most profound acts of courage often begin with the simplest of words, a name spoken in faith against the darkness, a single light released into the waiting sky.